won't go too deep into what you're going to see in the presentation here. We do have some important updates and progress to report to you, but also we're going to be continuing to engage the community over the next year as decisions are made in terms of the final scope of the project and exactly what it will look like. And we're going to do everything in our power to communicate to you, to let you know what's going on, to give you the opportunity to have input as the project continues to progress. And we're going to work to minimize the impacts and the disruption. But I don't want to sugarcoat the fact that there will be some impacts and there will be some disruption for those of us who live near the lake. We will experience some disruption when the project begins. Before we go into the presentations, while we have a large group here, I did just want to make a public health announcement and update. And some of you may have seen this already, that Governor Northam at 2 p.m. today announced a new round of COVID-19 restrictions that will go into effect this upcoming Monday, December 14th, including a modified stay-at-home order asking all Virginians to stay at home between the hours of 12 a.m. and 5 a.m. unless you're going to work or to get food, an expanded mask requirement, a reduction in the limit of social gatherings from 25 people to 10 people, continued limits on dining and restaurants, and continued encouraging folks to telework in Virginia. We have seen an uptick in cases in Fairfax County over the last several weeks. We had 440 cases today. Our numbers are starting to rival numbers that we saw at the height of the pandemic back in April and May. So it's really important that everyone continue to follow the guidance. Those of you who live in the Braddock District, probably most on this meeting, will be getting a message in the mail with some of those health reminders. So please take a look at the new guidance and follow them. Thanks everyone for joining tonight. Look forward to hearing your questions and your feedback on the presentation. Charles?
Thank you, James. Now what we'll do is kind of go through our presentation we have for you this evening. I'm going to start out, show you the, if I can get my thing going here. Yeah, so this evening, what we'll do is we'll go through a bit of the background, dredging history, and the park master planning history, which brought us to this point. After that, we'll go with a project overview. We'll talk about the team that's assembled for this project, go through the schedule, and then I'll turn it over to, I'll also talk a bit about the other things that are going on in the area. There's actually a lot of activity around Lake Accotink and Wakefield parks right now. Much of it doesn't have anything to do with this project. And then we'll turn it over to Arcadis so they can walk us through what they have planned and with upcoming next steps. And then we'll move to a question and answer period. We'll allow quite a bit of time for that. This meeting is scheduled till 8:30 p.m. And as Supervisor Walkinshaw stated before, as Justin stated before, we will be taking questions through the chat function, and Adam will talk a bit more about that when we get to that point. So the one thing to remind folks is that since 1967, this lake has been dredged 3 times previously, first by the Department of the Army, and then twice by the county. And the last time in 2008, we took about 200,000 yards or so of material out of the lake. It's filling in at a rate of 20,000 cubic yards per year or greater. And just a quick note, when you empty it, it fills more quickly because it's more efficient at capturing sediment. And then it was estimated as one of the studies of several years ago, the lake average depth is about 4 feet. It's likely lower than that now, but we'll know that here pretty shortly. We'll get the results back from some of the studies that are ongoing. So the Park Authority in their master planning process, they initiated the discussion about management options, and there were 5 public meetings held in 2016 on. Numerous studies were conducted, and then questionnaires sent out for seeking comments back and input from the public. And the bottom line is that 90% of people that responded favored having the lake. and 65 of those favored having retained the existing footprint, which means keeping the lake essentially as is. There's also, of course, Save Lake Accotink, was a nonprofit formed for help getting information out, and there are HOAs that contributed to that support also. So the project that we have in front of us now is to take we estimated previously about 350,000 cubic yards of material need to be removed to restore an average lake depth of 8 feet. We looked at options of where we could potentially pump sediments to. That was part of the study process that went on during the master planning phase. And it was determined that we really didn't have any options outside of the public lands, and that the most appropriate place where we could potentially get the room to do it and have the access is up in the Wakefield Park area, so north of Braddock Road. As part of this project, we will not only do the initial dredge, we will set up the basis for a maintenance dredging program. So in future years, as dredging is necessary, we'll have it set up so that we can enter into a dredge process without this additional effort. It makes it much easier and cost effective. And of course, another primary goal is to retain the aesthetic and recreational values of the lake. In 2019, in September, the Board of Supervisors authorized county staff to seek funding in the amount of $30.5 million to pay for the dredging project. We have done that. We are actually waiting to hear back from the state of Virginia whether or not we will be awarded a loan of that amount to pay for the dredging. The annual maintenance costs, and these will include the future maintenance dredging, we estimate to be about $2 million. And then every 30 years or so, it'll cost us close to $5 million to do maintenance on the dam. As you recall, the dam at this point in time is about 80 years old. So the team we've assembled to run this project includes staff from the Department of Public Works. Tonight, myself and Justin Pastori are on. We also have folks from our maintenance division, and from our construction management division, and also from our wastewater collection division. On the Park Authority side, Valerie Maslin is heading up the coordination for the project, along with Adam Wynn, who will be speaking tonight and helping run the Q&A session. Dan Grolke is the manager at Lake Accotink Park from Park Services, Chris Goldbecker from Park Services, and Amber Strammel from Park Authority Area Management 2 there, and she is actually works out of Wakefield Park. Marcia Pape from Supervisor Walkinshaw's office is a part of our project team. And then on Arcadis, we have a really deep team. It includes Mike Wooden, Fernando Pasquale, Doug Sawyers, Akshay Kumar, Wesley Thomas, Amanda Kohler, Shannon Dunn, Susan Larcher, and then sub-consultants, Frank Graziano with WSSI, they'll be working on survey and permitting. And also we have the company ECS who's doing the geotechnical analysis. And a number of these folks that I've just listed will be speaking to you here shortly to talk more about the project. In addition, we've also been working with some of the key stakeholder groups, which includes the Friends of Lake Accotink Park, the Friends of Accotink Creek, Save Lake Accotink, and multiple homeowners associations and civic associations. So what to expect? When we get, first of all, at this time and through the next couple of years, we're really going to be doing first the analysis or the assessment of all the parkland between Lake Accotink and Wakefield Park, north of Braddock Road, to figure out where we can stage particular portions of the operation. Talk a bit about that in a few minutes. We'll be going through a analysis process next coming spring. Once we begin design, so there won't be any much on the ground activity until we actually get to the point of doing preparing for construction. And that we should be seeing activity in probably 2022, maybe the late part of 2022, preparing for the actual design. Once the dredging goes into operation, you'll see the dredging itself, pipelines, spoils processing operations. They'll be set up and running. We will anticipate daily commercial truck traffic north of Braddock Road, and this is going to be through the alternatives analysis, we'll identify where we can access a site, or we can process and remove the spoils, and that's what that truck traffic will be for. And then we'll have light vehicle traffic in Lake Accotink Park to access the dredging operation and the pipeline operation to make sure we can support those. And then we'll have, after that point, we'll have restoration and monitoring. So let's look at that schedule as to when you might see these activities. So right now we're in the data collection phase, and that will continue until next spring. And then in the summer, Arcadis is going to deliver an alternatives analysis, which basically is a summation of all the observations and measurements they've made within the park areas and recommendations on where we could conduct the different activities we need in order to do the project. We will go through a process. We'll be coming back out to the public, back to you guys, in July of next year to talk about the course of action the county's prepared to take. And then we will, by the end of that summer, we'll be going into design in 21. And so we hope to have the concept design and value engineering study conducted by April of 2022. And for those who are not familiar with county projects, any project with a construction value over $2 million has to go through value engineering. And that process allows us to assess the project to ensure we're getting the best cost and most effective project delivery. And then final design permitting, we anticipate by March of 23, and we should be ready to dredge when we get those permits. So we anticipate beginning to dredge no later than March of 23, completing the dredging by November of 2025, and moving directly into a post-construction monitoring period, which will take about 3 years. And by the way, I'm just going to remind you all of this is going to be, we're recording it, we'll be posting it on the project webpage, which we'll share with you again here shortly. So while we're doing this project, there's a lot of other work going on in the area. Right now, over on the west side of Lake Accotink Park near Rolling Road, Washington Gas is conducting some work related to their utility infrastructure. In addition, on the west side of the lake, the trail system there on the old rail bed, the Park Authority is doing work near the Danbury Forest area. VDOT has ongoing survey work along Braddock Road related to the Braddock Road improvement project. Shortly, we're going to be beginning construction in Accotink Park near the Dominion substation for the Accotink Creek at Wakefield Park stream restoration. And this is going to be along the main stem of the creek, so you'll see construction activity in that area beginning in the next couple months. Soon they're going to kick off, the park there will be kicking off the design for the renovation of Audrey Moore Rec Center, and that project should go into construction during the time that we're going to be starting the dredging operation. So there'll also be the renovation going on at that time. And then right now we are kicking off, or have kicked off, the field work with Arcadis and their subconsultants to do the assessment. Sorry. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to turn it over to Mike Wooden, who will talk a bit more about this project. And I am going to just double check with everybody. I'm hearing that I was muted. I apologize for that. My screen was not telling me that. Just check in real quick with Mike. Are you on?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Great. Did I convey enough information there, Mike? Because it looks like I was muted at some point. I'm not sure when I let off.
No, I think you're okay. You dropped off right as you started the transition, so I think you got through the slide content that you intended to.
All right, great. Well, I will drop off here and let you take over. Thank you.
All right, very good. Thanks, Charles. And while Akshay is bringing up our presentation, I'll give a quick introduction. Again, my name is Mike Wooden, and I'm the project manager for the Arcadis consulting team. I'm going to be joined by several of our team members tonight. We're going to provide to you an update on the pre-design activities that are currently underway. We'll start with a description of the field investigations that Charles mentioned. Those have recently begun, and those we'll also talk about how those are going to be used to collect information that will inform the evaluation of project alternatives and eventually the design. To get us started tonight, I'm going to turn it over to Frank Graziano of WSSI, and Frank is going to jump in on some of the survey work that we've been doing. Frank, over to you.
Thanks, Mike. Good evening, everybody. This initial scoping phase of the project, there's going to be two basic types of surveys conducted. One will be an aerial survey of the ground surface throughout the entire project area. That'll be collected by a fixed-wing aircraft that you can image on the lower right there depicts that. In support of that, you may see some of our surveyors, which is the picture on the lower left, out in the field locating targets on the ground that the airplane will take pictures of and record and help them create the topography for the surface. The other type of survey is a hydrographic survey, and that'll be conducted within the lake itself. And that has three components itself. There'll be a bathymetric survey, which will determine the elevation of the sediment throughout the lake, which will help calculate how much sediment is actually in there. There'll also be a side scan sonar deployed in areas that are deep enough to support that technology. And what that provides is basically a picture of what the bottom looks like, not only the sediment, but if there's any anomalies there that you should be aware of, any large objects that we could go take a closer look at. And then the third type is a magnetometer survey. And what that does is, as the name suggests, is it locates large pieces of metal that may be in there, because that would be problematic with the dredging operation. So we need to identify if those are there.
All right, I'm Wes Thomas. I'm going to talk a little bit about the sediment investigation piece that's a part of the field assessment. This is an investigation, or for the sediment investigation, we're planning to conduct in February of next year. So we have a couple of months between now and then. But really the primary objective of doing the sediment investigation is for us to study and understand what the physical properties of the sediment in the lake are, if there are areas within the lake where that material type changes. And what that will do will help us understand how easy sediment in different areas will be to dredge, and then how that material will behave as it's being dredged, and then also as it's being dewatered. The other thing that will help us understand is what potential beneficial reuse applications we might be able to take advantage of with the material after it's dewatered, or what disposal options we may want to consider. And so during this investigation, you might see a couple of different sampling methods being used on the lake itself. The one that you will see the most of is called Vibracore Sampling, and there's a photo of that in the middle of this slide here, where essentially an aluminum tube is vibrated into the sediment, and then that core is recovered, and then we can extrude the sediment from that core and look at what it looks like over the depth profile that we sampled. Once those cores are collected, we will transport them back to the shore. We'll have a box truck set up somewhere in the parking area of the Lake Accotink Park, where one of our scientists will be there to photograph the cores as they come in from the boat, and then collect a geologic log of the material inside the core. Once that log's been collected, there will be some of the material that we send off to a laboratory to conduct some testing. We will test things like grain size, moisture content. There's a test called Atterberg limits that helps us understand how silts and clays behave at different water contents. And then we'll be able to correlate from that lab data using the geologic logs from the different sample locations what the material type is across the footprint of the lake. And then the last thing we'll do is we'll take some fraction of the material that's collected and send it to a treatability laboratory in North Carolina, where we can simulate different dewatering operations and understand how the material will dewater, how long it might take to dewater, and other characteristics that we might want to consider during the alternatives analysis phase of the project or during the design itself. So if you want to go to the next slide, please. Here we've got a figure that essentially shows the plan for the sediment investigation. And just to orient everybody to what we're seeing, I'm sure everyone's familiar with Lake Accotink. We've got the mouth of Accotink Creek, over on the left-hand side of the figure, and then the boat launch area in the bottom right, and then of course the dam kind of towards the middle there. And one of the things I wanted to point out early here is there's a red line that you can see crossing the footprint of the lake in 2 locations. That's actually a 54-inch sanitary sewer that runs beneath the lake. So one of the considerations that's been important for us to take as we've been thinking about the best way to conduct this investigation is that we want to stay well away from that utility. And so you can see there's 2 dashed lines on either side of the red line. Those 2 dashed lines represent a 30-foot offset on either side of the utility. And our field crew is going to make sure that we're staying well outside of that buffer. Some of those hydrographic survey methods that Frank mentioned in the previous 2 slides will also help us to understand if there are other obstructions or potentially unknown utilities, as unlikely as that might be. But that we can use those surveys as lines of evidence to help make sure that we are putting these sample locations in the right place in the lake. And then overall, our sampling approach is based on transects. And you can see in this figure, we've got 10 transects that span across the lake as we move from the mouth of Accotink Creek down towards the dam. And those transects are spaced a little bit closer together in the western portion of the lake around that island. And the reason that is because that's the area that's been historically dredged. And so we can get a lot of information there about the sediment that has deposited within the lake footprint over the last 12 years since the last dredging operation was completed in 2008. And that will help us not only in the dredge design, but also understand what kind of material it has been coming into the lake over the recent time period, because that will be the material that we can anticipate during future maintenance dredging events. Okay, now I'm going to hand it over to Akshay, who's going to talk a little bit about the geotechnical investigation.
Hoping everyone can see me and hear me. My name is Akshay Kumar. I'll be the assistant project manager for this project, as well as the pipeline design lead for this project. One of the key important investigations we're going to conduct through the field work period is understanding the geotechnical properties of the soil. Due to various work that's going to be done over the course of the dredging operation, including truck activity, as well as location of the pumping systems, and then routing of the pipeline for the conveyance of the dredge material, and location of the dredge processing itself, it is important to understand the properties of the soil and the water itself. So what we're going to try to do is collect as much as information we can about the soil, which forms the basis for earthwork and other structural components that are going to be built. So first and foremost, the activities that are going to entail would be soil borings. We have ECS, who's our sub, that's going to be doing most of these work. They'll be coming out to site and taking soil borings at predetermined location. That's going to help us understand and get a map of the properties of the soil in the project area. And what you see in terms of the pictures towards the left is just a representation of the various drill rigs that are going to be brought on site for taking the borings. And depending on where the borings are going to be taken and how deep they need to go, the configuration and the type of drill rigs are going to be different. And this is just a representation of the various drill rigs that we've used previously on other projects. That doesn't mean that this is exactly what we're going to use here. We're going to be very cognizant of the site and make sure that whatever clearing or is required is going to be minimized, and the impact is going to be minimized. The other important thing to try to understand about the site itself is the groundwater, because this is surrounding lake. We need to understand where the groundwater is and how far into the surrounding areas the groundwater is. So we're going to be putting in ground monitoring wells that's going to monitor the groundwater over a certain period of time. Finally, all the borings that are going to be taken by ECS will be sent to laboratories for testing of various physical properties of the soil itself. So it's going to help us understand the properties of the soil and also help us in the design itself later on. With that, I'll hand it over to Frank Graziano, WSSI.
Okay, thanks, Akshay. You know, one thing I neglected to mention as far as the survey goes is that the hydrographic survey was completed over the past couple of weeks. So, you know, people may have noticed a small boat out there for a week or so. And I got to look at the magnetometer results just an hour or so before the meeting, and it's pretty fascinating. You absolutely can see that sanitary lateral. So hopefully that'll be very, very helpful. I wanted to talk a little bit about the desktop evaluations that we're also conducting. And natural and cultural resources are going to be a very important component of this project in terms of wanting to minimize impact. So to help guide us as the project team as we move through the alternatives analysis, we're going to be, for the first go around, do a desktop evaluation of the wetlands as well as the vegetative community mapping, primarily trees. And what this will be is photo interpretation of aerial imagery. And this exhibit that I have shown here, the yellow hatching is an approximation of where the wetlands are, and this is the lake. Again, it's done through the photo interpretation. It makes sense. There's a lot of wetlands down there, as anybody who's been around the lake knows that's the case. And then as the project progresses and hone in on the actual work area, we will actually have people out in the field delineating exactly where the wetlands are, as well as survey locating trees. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Mike.
Great, thanks, Frank. So we're also are pleased to be able to share a summary of the selection criteria that we've begun working to develop with Charles and his team. And while we haven't yet defined the alternatives themselves, we got started by, again, developing those selection criteria that will be used to evaluate the alternatives, looking at the categories being dredging, sediment transport, and processing. And so again, I'm going to throw it back over to Wes to start us off with a discussion of the selection criteria that will be used for the dredging evaluation. Wes?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So in order to really evaluate the differences between different alternative approaches and ultimately, select the best overall approach for the project, we have prepared a set of criteria that we want to use that are specific to each design element, as Mike said. And so on this slide, we've got the selection criteria that have been prepared for the dredging design. And what you'll see on this slide and the next few slides is that we have divided the criteria into 4 categories, which include park management, community-related criteria, environment, and construction-related criteria. And the table shows somewhat of a breakdown of what these would include, but at a really high level, the park management criteria is really there to help us assess how well a particular alternative will meet the overall objectives for the project. And so that includes maintaining water depths for recreational use and being consistent with future maintenance programs, trying to make the most out of those future maintenance programs. Community-related criteria consider, the extent to which the project will limit or restrict recreational use of the lake during construction. And we'll also consider other community concerns that would include things like noise or light or odor that might come up during construction. The environment criteria considers potential impacts to wetlands, habitat areas, downstream water quality, and even cultural resources. It'll also consider potential changes to the floodplain that might result from the dredging activities and any long-term water quality improvements that might be realized as a part of the project. And then the last piece to that environment category is the overall sustainability of different dredging alternatives. And then finally, the construction criteria includes a number of factors there, but really that's how much each alternative is able to implement the work safely, timely, and cost effectively. And so I'll turn it over to Akshay now to walk through the selection criteria that apply to the dredging pipeline.
Thank you, Wes. Appreciate that. Piggybacking on what Wes said, we're going to be utilizing the same set of categories and selection criteria for all the design elements, including the dredging operations pipeline, and what Amanda will be talking on the next slide, so that we have a set of criteria that is consistent across the board for comparison of various alternatives. Pipeline being one of the most important part of the project, because it conveys the material that's dredged to the point where it's going to be processed and dewatered for disposal or whatever the case might be at the end. And so because the pipeline traverses such a long distance, you know, from the lake to the point where it's going to be processed, it's going to be important to consider how the pipeline is going to be routed and where it will be routed. And of course, it's got to be consistent with the park management in terms of its long-term vision for the park, like Wes mentioned. And is it going to be, you know, where's the pipeline going to be for the maintenance dredging as well? And of course, we ought to make sure that the community continues to use the lake for recreational use and consider other community concerns and make sure that the pipeline alignment and the pumping system and the dredge processing is not in a place that's going to be hindering the recreational use of the lake. As Wes mentioned, I think environmental considerations are really key in terms of where the pipeline is going to be located. We want to make sure that we minimize any environmental impacts and you know, ensure that you know, the floodplain impacts are minimized as well. Construction is going to be key, because we got to make sure that the pipeline can be constructed and maintained and it's accessible for future and current future maintenance dredging and current dredging as well. And we ought to make sure that when we do construct a dredging operation, it can be maintained easily and can be you know, serviced going forward into the future. Obviously, cost being an important factor here as well. So we want to make sure we balance all the different criteria. What you see on the right side, all the different photos, is just a representation of some of the work we've done in the past. We're going to try to minimize, obviously, all the impacts to the surrounding areas. The photo in the middle shows the minimal approach towards clearing, which is pipeline through the woods, which is what most likely will be the case. What you see at the bottom is basically there used to be an existing access road, and the pipeline was put on the existing access road, which was an easier option. So we didn't really not clear any trees to put pipelines there. For that project, we had an access road, and so we kind of utilized that access road. So when it comes to putting the pipeline, we're going to try and minimize any impacts to it and consider the community concerns aspect of it as well. With that, I'll turn it over to Amanda.
Thanks, Akshay.
All right.
So hi, my name is Amanda Kohler, and I'm an environmental engineer with Arcadis, and I'm going to be leading the design of the dredge material processing. So as far as the alternatives analysis, what we're looking at for the material processing is both a combination of the location of the processing area as well as potential dewatering methods. Some examples of methods that might be used include a mechanical dewatering method similar to the photo shown at the top, or more of a passive dewatering system, which is represented by the two other photos on this slide. So once we develop our dredge material processing alternatives, the various selection criteria that we'll use is going to be fairly similar to what both Wes and Akshay discussed in the previous slide. So I just want to touch on a few of the ones that are shown in this slide. So probably one of the key items that we'll be evaluating is the available area for the watering. And included in this would also be proximity to floodplain. So the goal is to try and minimize any floodplain impacts, as well as minimize any potential conflicts of flooding with the construction schedule. And it's also associated with the available area for dewatering. As we're trying to identify those areas, we're going to be considering what preparation requirements will be required to make those sites suitable for dewatering. One of the next options or next criteria that I'd like to touch on is how we evaluate the various dewatering options for any potential community impacts. Those namely would be the truck traffic of trucks transporting sediment offsite for disposal or other beneficial reuse. There's also a potential for construction odors or equipment noise. And so one thing as we're evaluating those impacts on the community would also be evaluating potential mitigation measures that can be employed to mitigate or minimize any community impacts. The third item I'd like to touch on briefly in the selection criteria is, again, that compatibility with the long-term operation and maintenance associated with the project. So in order to account for that, one of the things we're going to be looking into is the flexibility of both the area and the potential mechanisms of dewatering to allow for various equipment. And this is important due to the need to accommodate the contractor's available equipment, both for the main dredging operation as well as the operation and maintenance dredging that gets performed in future years. So I think with that, I'll complete this overview of the selection criteria and turn the call back over to Charles.
All right, let me share my screen here. So I wanted to go ahead and just at this point, we're going to enter the question and answer period. Adam, would you like to take charge?
Yes, thank you, Charles. Can everybody hear me? So during this time, we'll be answering questions that you can ask within the Zoom chat feature. If you hover over the bottom of your window, you can click on the chat icon and that'll open up a chat box. And a reminder, any questions that are not able to answer during this meeting will be posted along with other responses on the Lake Accotink Dredging project website within a couple days after this meeting. Also, as a reminder, the comments or questions about this project can be submitted through the Dredging project website at any time. So the first question from Mike Perel. Does sediment analysis help to identify where it came from upstream as possible approach to preventing it from redepositing in the future? Wesley, can you answer this one?
Yeah, I can take a shot at this one, and I think the answer is going to be a little related to another question from Mike, where he asked if there was any information from previous dredging projects that are useful to the current study. So when we look at the results, the physical properties of the sediment in the lake coming out of the field investigation, we expect to see a different grain sizes as you move throughout the lake. So close to the mouth of Accotink Creek, we expect to see some coarser materials, some sand, where the lake was deepened, and then some of those heavier materials were able to settle out in that deep portion of the lake. And then as you move further away from Accotink Creek, it's likely that we will start to see more silts and maybe some clays there, where the heavier material will have already settled out, and the lake itself is so large that the residence time that would be needed for some of those smaller particles to settle out will do that. We won't be able to necessarily fingerprint where either the sandier materials or those silts and clays have come from upstream. But what I will say is that there has been some study done during some of the previous dredging work in the early 2000s that took a pretty good look at the sources of sedimentation coming into the lake. And as part of that study, they did some calculations to estimate, how quickly the lake would fill up based on what the upstream conditions looked like. And so we are able to use some of that information to understand, where generally the sediment's coming from, but not maybe where specifically it's coming from.
Okay.
Hope that answered the question.
And here is a question from Shepard. Will core samples be drilled at least as deep as the intended dredge? How will the analysis account for potential changes to the depth and total volume of sediment between the end of the study and the actual commencement of the dredge? Will the increase in sediment increase the cost of the project? in real time. There's a couple questions there. I don't know, Wesley, if you're able to address that first one.
Yeah, sure thing. So this is also related a little bit to Mike's question about the information from previous dredging, but we do know where with the footprint of the last two larger dredging activities in the lake, and we've got a pretty good understanding of how deep the dredging was done. We have both the design drawings and some of the as-built information from the most recent dredging project. And so when we were thinking about how deep we wanted to core as part of this investigation, we really wanted to look at it from an elevation standpoint. And so if we knew that the previous dredging activities were conducted to a certain elevation, we wanted to make sure that our cores were going to be advanced to be 1 or 2, in some cases maybe a little bit more, feet below what that target elevation was of the previous dredging event, and really tie the thickness of the cores that we were studying to an elevation instead of a depth, so that we could account for potential changes in bathymetry over time. And then how will the analysis account for potential changes in the depth and the total volume? So one thing I can say, we are coming out of a survey. So Frank talked about the hydrographic surveys that were just completed. We don't quite have that information yet, but we do have a bathymetry survey that was conducted in, I believe, 2015, in addition to what was done coming out of the dredging in 2008. So we'll be able to have a couple of pictures of what the changes in the bathymetry looked like over the last 12 years or so, and be able to see where we've gotten the most amount of sedimentation, and generally what the sedimentation rates have been over the last decade. So Charles at the beginning mentioned that we have an estimate for that, but we should be able to shore that estimate up with the progressive survey information, and therefore hopefully project or account for some of that additional deposition that may happen between now and construction of the project.
Adam, I was having some difficulty sharing my screen. I'm going to put my screen back up so everybody can see the the project web page URL, just in case they want to write that down for future access. But keep going.
Okay.
Go ahead, Adam.
You can continue.
Well, I think that so the last project, or the last part of that, was the potential increase in cost. It's really hard to answer that question at this point. I think that we will want, when we prepare the alternatives analysis, when we look at something like cost effectiveness, we would account for the potential influx of sediment between now and the design. And then part of that analysis is also accounting for the cost of future maintenance events. And so I think that the sedimentation rate would be related to accounting for both of those costs during the alternatives analysis phase.
One other item I'd like to throw in on top of that is that cost for this project, and this is it's a major issue that Arcadis will be addressing, is cost estimates. But cost for dredging operations is highly variable. It's not just the volume, it's fuel costs, it's the cost of fees to dispose of the material, which has a lot to do with the composition of the material. So there's a lot of variables that will come into play as those cost estimates are updated.
Thank you, Charles. And just as a reminder to everybody, the website address on the screen, comments can be submitted there currently, and also anytime during the project. So I just want to put that out there. If for any reason we're not able to address your comment today or get to a certain question, that is always available. So here's a question from Mike Perrell. Is there any information from previous dredgings that are useful to the conduct of the current study? Charles, do you want to answer that one?
I think Wes touched on it a bit. I'd rather defer to the Arcadis folks, just because they're looking at that material now and have much better expertise than I do in terms of the information contained in those reports. Would that be Wes or possibly Shannon?
I'm happy to take a shot at that one too. So I touched on a couple of things that we have, but I think the simple answer is yes. We've got really great documentation going back to the early 80s actually, and so we've got studies that were performed to support the last two major maintenance dredging events, both the basis for those dredging events and the design of those dredging events themselves. And so there is a lot of information that we have available to us to look back on, and we've looked at that. It has influenced the way that we have designed this field sampling plan, and also it will factor into the design of the project down the road.
All right, thank you, Wesley. From Mary Lipsy, how large is the area needed for dewatering? Can you estimate that now? Wesley, I think that might be you as well.
I may let Amanda speak to that one if you
Okay.
don't mind.
Yes, I can answer that one. So we don't have an estimate for it right now. There are a number of factors that play into the size that's needed, including the ability of the sediment to dewater. So that's one of the items that we're hoping to get, or that we're planning to get out of the treatability study. So that'll be one factor. The assumed dredging production rate will be another, as well as the method of dewatering. Usually, in general, mechanical dewatering does allow for a little bit of a smaller footprint, but it does have some other drawbacks associated with it. So I think those are probably the main factors that would influence the size. And once we get into the alternatives analysis, we'll be able to determine a little bit better what potential sizes there are, and those that will be presented in the alternatives analysis.
Thank you, Amanda. From Rhodas, will the pipeline used for the initial dredge remain in place permanently for subsequent dredges? I'm going to field that to somebody at Arcadis.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and take the first whack at it, and Akshay, please jump in if you have anything to add. But I think what the short answer, Adam, is and Rhonda is that is an option that we are looking at for the county. It's going to be a question as to whether or not the location of that pipeline is going to be conducive to being left in place, and whether that's something that the county wants to have in place for a future maintenance activity, versus an alternative that might utilize more of a temporary pipeline alignment that'll have to be then reinstalled when the maintenance activity happens. So it's an option on the table, but no decision has been made yet.
And then from Suzanne, are any areas already being considered for dewatering? Mike, you want to take a spin at that one as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general terms, Charles showed the map at the outset, and, we're generally looking at areas available north of Braddock Road. As I mentioned, when we talked about, or when I introduced the discussion of the selection criteria, we haven't yet defined the alternatives. And, those alternatives are not only where will we dredge within the reservoir, and where will we locate, offloading operations at the reservoir, what alignment we follow with a pipeline, and where do we locate the processing areas. Those will all comprise the suite of alternatives that we ultimately will be evaluating. So we're not quite there yet, but generally speaking, we're looking at areas north of Braddock Road.
Okay. From Rhoda's, what are the wildlife impact studies telling us, especially water-based food chain impact on the eagles and other wildlife? I guess, Frank, do you want to answer this?
Yeah, I mean, I can take a crack at it. There haven't been any studies done yet as far as potential wildlife impact. I mean, we're really just getting going as far as scoping this thing out. But as I mentioned in talking about the desktop study for the vegetation, natural and cultural resources of all kinds are going to be looked at with the intent and the goal of minimizing any impact. So that includes, wildlife, not only in the lake, but as the question asked, eagles and others. So I guess I'd say stay tuned on that one, but it is something that's going to be a consideration.
Thank you, Frank. And I think I might have missed a question here. Not necessarily related to dredging, but interested from the master plan standpoint of there are any optimal spots along the creek for one of those innovative trash collection systems. I think for the purposes of this meeting, I'm just going to reply that that's noted, and we'll definitely consider things like that as we move along into the master plan. From Paul McLean, if the pipeline is permanent, will its route be proposed and discussed publicly before final routing is set?
This is Charles. Yes. So we will, after the alternatives analysis is prepared, staff will go through it. We will brief the supervisor, Supervisor Walkinshaw, and we'll also then come back and present it to the public. So we'll have a public comment period on that, and we anticipate that occurring sometime in the next July. So we will definitely bring all the information back to you, the alternatives analysis itself, as well as the staff recommendation before the final decisions are made.
Thank you, Charles. From Mary. Sorry.
Charles, this is James Walkinshaw. Could I just jump in there real quick? A couple questions about the permanent pipeline, and obviously, you know, we don't want to prejudge Arcadis's work and want them to give us an intellectually honest alternatives analysis based on their best judgment. You know, I'll just say, and Charles and I have discussed this months ago, I would be very concerned about a permanent pipeline. So absolutely, that is not a decision that would be made without us coming back to the community and explaining why, at least from my perspective, it's really the only viable option. So I just wanted to throw that in there. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
From Mary, what types of items are dredged up? Is it possible you may dredge up a Civil War era mini ball? What is the impact on fish and wildlife during the dredging? So I think there's two questions there. The first part of that question, maybe somebody from Arcadis could give a little bit of information on anything, what typically gets dredged up in other lakes.
Yeah, maybe I'll start and I'll ask Wes to jump in. You know, I think, and Frank described it in his piece too, when he talked about the survey work that's being done. He mentioned the side scan sonar and the magnetometer work that's being done. Those are specifically geared toward seeing what's down there, both on and, you know, immediately below the surface of the sediment in the lake. So, you know, as you can imagine, in a lake like this, any number of things may be encountered. We're generally looking to design our dredging program to target sediment, you know, and not, you know, balls and Volkswagens. But we'll know when they're there, and we'll certainly be able to deal with debris and other things that may be found along the bottom of the lake. And maybe I'll stop there and ask Wes to jump in on potential impact on fish and wildlife, and just how the dredging program is designed typically to try to minimize that and to focus the activity.
Sure. And, you know, and then yeah, I'll do that one. So we commonly, when we get to the design phase for a project, employ any number of engineering controls that are, you know, in the specifications for the project that help protect things like water quality. So during dredging work, there are engineering controls like curtains that hang down into the water that prevent the silt that gets kicked up during dredging from being transported downstream. And so those are things that we commonly require for projects. And so the design will consider what potential you know, fish and wildlife you know, impacts may apply to the project, and then typically the design will seek to accommodate those. And then just to add to you know, what Mike was saying earlier, those hydrographic surveys will help us understand what might be down at least at the sediment surface and maybe in the buried in the shallow surface or shallow sediment. The fact that the lake has been dredged twice in the last 20 years means that a lot of the dredging that will be done will likely be material that has deposited into the lake somewhat recently. That said, it's common that we find interesting things in the bottoms of lakes and rivers in the planning process for these kinds of projects.
Let me throw in one more comment on that. I think one of the key things to remember about the lake itself is that it has extremely poor water quality. And we worked several years ago with the Department of Game and Fisheries, now Department of Wildlife Resources, to assess the fishery. They described the fishery as extremely poor. And since that time, the lake has silted in even more. So the quality of the fishery is very low. So the productivity is low because of the high turbidity, the shallow depths of the water. And then, of course, every time you get a big rain, you get more sediment moving in. And in the summertime, because of the shallow depths, it's very low oxygen levels with the high heat. So the fishery impacts should be, there definitely will be some temporary impacts on the fish that are there, but the quality of the fishery is so poor that the aftermath of the dredge is that we'll have a much deeper lake, which should have a better overall water quality because of the depth and the ability to not only support life, have greater layering in the water in terms of the temperatures, which usually means better oxygen conditions too.
Thank you, Charles. From Chris, did I understand correctly that the pipeline or portions of it will be permanent to facilitate future maintenance dredging? If so, would those sections be buried? I think we already addressed and answered the permanence and the possibility of that for the pipeline. But for the second part of the question, will those sections be buried? Somebody from Arcadis could address that perhaps.
Yeah, Adam, this is Mike again. I mean, most likely, yes. I mean, again, we haven't yet defined the alternatives, including where the pipeline alignment might be. But in all likelihood, if we were talking about any permanent option, it would more than likely be a buried pipeline. But again, that is something that we will going to be looking at here over the next several months. And as Charles said, the intent would be to come back and share what we've come up with during the middle part of next year.
Thank you, Mike. From Richard, given the shallow depth of the lake now and the rate of sedimentation flow in and the fact that dredging will not start for 3 years, is it possible that the lake will silt in completely before dredging starts? Charles, do you want to?
I think the likelihood is the lake already is extremely shallow. I don't know anyone can answer that question. Large storm events move in large amounts of sediment, but they also mobilize sediment and move sediment out of the lake. So I think it'll retain pockets. I think what our expectation is that the poor quality of the water column will remain that way until we begin to increase the depth. But I certainly appreciate the concern. I think we're already seeing and have seen for years summer fish kills as the oxygen depletes. You have ship fish like white perch, which are highly susceptible to conditions in the water being poor. They die off, and that's been happening now for years. So I don't perceive a tremendous change in the quality of the fishery between now and the time we begin to dredge. And in terms of the depths, probably will fluctuate a bit, but certainly we are getting more sediment in. But again, some sediments mobilize with large storm events.
Thank you, Charles. From Janet, what are the plans for the bridge at the dam? If Paul or Valerie wants to answer this question.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So there's a bridge, a pedestrian bridge that goes from basically downstream of the dam where the cross-county trail goes through partly there, and then the other trail on the other side of the dam. But anyway, it bridges that low area where it's subject to overflows from the spillway. So this bridge project had been on hold pending resolution of the whole situation at with the dam and the dredging. And so now that the dredging projects move forward and it's not anticipated that there's any conflict with the two projects, we're starting to update the plans and permits on that bridge project. So we anticipate going to construction on that in 2021.
Thank you, Paul. From Tom Lanning, I was under the impression that many options were still on the table as to the overall approach to managing the lake, such as dredging, having a smaller lake, doing nothing at all. Is this true, or has a decision already been made that dredging the lake will in fact happen? I think either Charles or somebody from Supervisor Walkinshaw's office could address this question.
I'll just jump in real quickly. The decision was made. It's been, I can't remember, it's early in 2019, I believe. The decision was made to go ahead with dredging the lake and keeping the lake as is. As I mentioned in the previous slide presentation, what the county received was tremendous support for keeping the lake, A, and B, keeping the lake as is. So what we are moving forward with is a dredging operation. And the only real change was there was discussion previously about dredging with a forebay versus dredging without a forebay, and it was determined that a forebay would not be efficient enough to remove enough sediment to reduce the frequency that we'd have to dredge the main lake at any real cost savings. So we decided to go without a forebay and proceed with dredging the whole lake, and then periodically re-dredging when it fills into a certain level, but never letting it back up to where it is now in terms of the depth or the shallowness of the water.
From Greg, do you expect the water level of the lake will remain the same during the project, or may it be lower? I guess somebody from Arcadis?
Yeah, so Adam, I think it's you know, too early to say definitively. It's certainly one of the things we'll be looking at with respect to the method of dredging and whether or not adjusting the water level would be beneficial in any way. But in all honesty, I'd say it's one of the alternatives, or when we're looking at developing the alternatives, it's one of the things we'll be looking at. And evaluating the feasibility of one approach versus the other.
I'll throw in one thing though, is that we have previously discussed the difficulty of dry dredging in a lake like this that's so flashy. The bottom line is the size of this drainage area is massive. It's 30 square miles. So the lake is dramatically undersized for the size of the area. And also there aren't that many controls, so it's a very flashy system for the size of the system. The other thing to remember is this lake, this dam, does not have controls that allow us to readily lower and raise water levels. Most of our other large dams in the county are much more modern. They have riser structures in the lake that allow us to have some ability to adjust the water flow or the water levels. This lake sits at full pool all the time, and there is a valve that we use to drain it down when the Park Authority and the county did maintenance on the dam about 10 years ago, but that valve is typically buried under sediment. So there's fewer options as the dam is currently configured to manipulate water levels. So certainly Arcadis will evaluate the options, but I think that unless we'll figure it out when we get to the alternatives analysis, but that's kind of the condition as it sits.
Thank you, Charles. From Suzanne, will the cardboard boat regatta be affected? It is the most popular event at the park. Maybe you want to take a try at this, Dan? Sounds like Dan is missing. Charles, you want to try to fill this?
We'll have to wait to see what the Arcadis comes up with in terms of where we need to dredge, and then thinking about a dredge schedule. The Marina area is pretty small, and it is isolated down towards the bottom of the dams. We have to work with the Park Authority on timing and Arcadis on the dredge schedule. So we'll have to get back to you once we get the plan in place. I mean, our intent is to minimize impact on park activities. So we would try to work hard with the Park Authority to make sure we would stay out of that area. If we need to go in at all, to stay out of that area during the regatta. So that would be our intent.
Okay. From Philip Latassa, from Friends of Accotink Creek, the dewatering site will likely come at the expense of clearing 5 acres of woods in Wakefield Park. Given the impracticality of other nearby sites, this was not part of the bargain when citizens advocated for saving the full lake. How can we come together to avoid this environmental sacrifice, tolerate trucks in neighborhoods, alternate sites, methods, reconsider the smaller lake, others? Do you want to field this one as well, Charles?
Sure. I certainly appreciate Philip's comment. Our intent is not to pit one thing against another. So I think what we'll need to do is wait for the alternatives analysis to be completed to understand what the options are and understand what the costs and benefits are of all the options. And at that point, we'll be prepared to have a good discussion about what is the most feasible way to go forward with this and what the cost benefits are or could be.
Thank you, Charles. From Ellie, how much deeper will the lake be? How deep is it now? We have somebody from Arcadis.
Sorry. Yeah, Adam, I think the question of how deep is it now we'll be able to answer shortly, because as Frank mentioned, we've recently completed an updated bathymetric survey that'll give us information regarding depth and sediment deposition. As far as how much deeper it will be, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Charles, but on average, we're looking for another 4 feet of depth across the lake. That might affect some areas more than others when we look at where the target sediment for removal is, but just in round numbers, that's what we're talking about.
And Mike, while you're still there, question from Kevin. Will the old sediment islands finally be removed?
It's certainly something we'll be looking at. Again, it comes down to identifying where the best locations will be for removal of sediment, both to achieve the goal of the current project, as well as to set us up, set Fairfax County up for the most effective and efficient maintenance program down the road. So from Arcadis's perspective, I don't think I could answer that definitively today, but it's certainly one of the things that'll be on the table when we look at where to go for removal.
Thank you, Mike. From Rhonda's, was the concept of a forebay to capture future sediment abandoned? Charles, do you want to answer that?
Yes, and the answer is yes. And again, the reason why is that although forebays do work when you have a lake and a forebay that's sized for a drainage area. So for instance, when the most recent large dredge operation we completed was the Royal Lake Dredge. As part of that dredge and as part of several other dredges in the Pohick watershed where we have lakes that are really well sized for their drainage areas, forebays, we put in forebays that have submerged weir arms, and those can be very effective in that situation because again, you have a properly sized lake for the watershed. But because Accotink is the watershed, the drainage area is so massive coming to this lake, which is critically undersized for the size of the drainage area, a forebay could not be efficient enough to remove enough sediment quickly enough that it would substantially reduce or increase the time period between different dredges. It would just simply fill up, and then the additional sediment that's coming in large quantities, which is the amount of sediment passing through that lake or coming to the lake each year is actually estimated somewhere around 45 to 46,000 cubic yards, of which 20 to 23,000 is currently being captured. So even if you build a forebay, it will rapidly silt in, and then you still have this massive plume coming past the forebay, which would be captured in that lake anyway because it still has a relatively high efficiency. So there was no appreciable benefit, and it would have been a large cost plus a large impact to excavate out that forebay. And then recurring dredging costs of having to do that frequently and go back to the main lake may have actually been more expensive than just simply dredging the lake again.
Thank you, Charles. From Robert, what is one thing each of us can do to reduce runoff from our home or business? This is kind of I guess a general question. I don't know, Charles, if there's a resource that you could point towards for folks to learn about how they can reduce runoff.
Yeah, I think there is. There's one of the resources is you can, there's a couple. One is the Northern Virginia Stormwater Conservation District has a lot of resources on their webpage that relate to doing things on your property which can reduce runoff. There are also some resources on the Fairfax County Stormwater webpage, especially on our maintenance side. We have flyers which talk about maintenance of existing facilities, whether or not you have a rain garden or some other low impact development type facility on your property. I'd say that in general too, the biggest issue is concentration of water. So if you're able to disconnect drain spouts and send water coming off of a roof into a lawn or a turf area so it can be spread out, slow down, and hopefully infiltrate. Also putting in either a cistern or increasing the amount of tree and shrub cover you have on your property, because when it does rain, trees and shrubs, when they're leafed out, intercept a lot of water and they slow it down, and their deep root systems help process it. So I think I would suggest going to the Soil and Water website and also thinking about aspects of increasing, again, the leaf surface area of your property and disconnecting drain spouts. If you have an option of redoing a driveway so it has pervious pavers, things like that, those can be kind of expensive, but there are some simple ways to kind of break that water up and slow it down.
Thanks, Charles. So from Jay, the dam is over 70 years old, and my concern is carrying capacity and safety of the dam after dredging. Is it safe to hold increased water volume? Paul, do you want to answer that one? Is Paul there?
Yeah, could you repeat that? I missed it.
The dam is over 70 years old, and my concern is carrying capacity and safety of the dam after dredging. Is it safe to hold the increased water volume?
Well, that was the original lake volume or close to it. So we're simply reestablishing prior conditions at the dam. And as far as the overall safety of the dam, we're required to get certification from the state, DCR, Department of Conservation and Recreation. So we have to submit for that every few years to get that certification and have to demonstrate adequacy of the dam.
Thank you, Paul. Question from Paul McLean. Perhaps a stupid question, but if the lake is dramatically undersized, why not let it fill in more? Or does that imply a different dam or other infrastructure implications? No stupid questions here. I think I want to field that to somebody at Arcadis.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start off here, and you know, even Charles may want to jump in, but I think Charles did mention previously has a lot to do with water quality and really the functionality of that lake. You know, and I think it's a fundamental decision about the lake as an amenity and as a recreational feature. So if we were to continue and do nothing, you know, we would be moving toward or moving away from what the decision was relative to recovering that lake. So I think that, you know, from a dredging perspective, given the goal for the lake, it's time to take a look at the options for restoring that volume. Charles, is there anything you'd add on to that?
I think you brought up some really good points, Mike. I think that this was certainly discussed when we were looking at management options for the lake. A do nothing option is always something that we look at, but the do nothing option, as Mike indicated, from a water quality perspective, it doesn't benefit water quality because essentially the trapping capacity of the lake diminishes over time. It'll move some sediment out, so it'll maintain some depth to it, but that means that the less it can trap, the more goes downstream. So you're going to have a flow-through component for the downstream area. And the second thing is, as Mike also hit on, is that you then lose the recreational benefit of the lake, the aesthetic benefit of the lake, and any water quality that you would have in the area, the ability to support wildlife within the lake diminishes significantly. You will retain clearly some nice wetland features around the lake, mud flats that harbor shorebirds. You'll have some depth where you may have animals that come in periodically, but in terms of a fishery, it's largely non-existent when that lake fills in to a large degree.
Charles, I think, I'm sorry, I saw that Paul clarified his question, and I apologize for starting down the wrong track, but I think Paul was asking about letting it become bigger, and I don't know whether Paul or Sherry may want to comment on that, someone familiar with the dam itself.
Right. So could you rephrase the question there?
Right, Adam.
So the
I'm not seeing the chat, so I'm not sure how it was phrased.
but if the lake is dramatically undersized, why not let it fill in more? Or does that imply a different dam or other infrastructure implications? Didn't mean to fill it in, but let it be a bigger lake and let it get bigger.
Well, I'm not sure anything's undersized. You had an original lake size, and then it's filled in with sediment. So what we're seeking to do is restore back in time to a previous time frame, and in terms of size of the lake.
Yeah, and I just add on. I don't quite understand the context, but the lake, as Paul indicated, it has shrunk from an original size. The current size we're dealing with is a 55-acre surface footprint, and the intent is to dredge that 55-acre footprint to restore that average 8-foot depth. So the lake will not get larger than the 55-acre footprint under this program. So the county's approach is that we will maintain that 55-acre lake.
All right, I'm seeing some clarification now about saying it's undersized for the watershed.
Oh,
and I think that simply gets at for the, maybe it was mentioned earlier, what's the drainage area to the lake? How many square miles? 20 to 25 or so?
It's 30 square miles.
30, okay. Yeah, for 30 square miles of drainage area, I think that's what may have been said about the size of the lake, or just the hydraulics of that whole lake system. It's not how we would necessarily design it today for a 30 square mile drainage area.
I would agree. I guess the big issue is that there is no capability with the current location and infrastructure to create an impoundment large enough to be properly sized for that watershed.
Okay, we're getting a couple more questions. A question from Tom: are there any concurrent projects or future projects in place to address the increased rate at which the lake is filling? Charles, I think you can address that one.
Yes, we have actually done a lot of projects in this watershed, and we have a lot more planned. So we've implemented, actually constructed about 4 stream restorations upstream of the lake. And we have, I think, about 6 or 7 more already in advanced planning stages. One going to construction now, which is the Accotink Creek at Wakefield project on the main stem. We've actually also initiated a project called the Long Branch Central Watershed Management Area Project. So Long Branch is the large tributary that comes under Braddock Road west of the main stem at Wakefield Chapel Road at Canterbury Woods Park. And that entire 3.7 square mile drainage area, we are beginning the process of evaluating it and then planning for restoration in that entire watershed. So we have some pretty aggressive plans to try to tackle the sources of the sediment, being the stream piece, The difficulty we have is that we don't control the uplands to control the water coming off that. So what's termed source control in terms of detention facilities. The county's plans for the next however many years is really to try to focus on reducing that in-stream erosion and decreasing that sediment load so that we can improve the water quality in those individual stream reaches, but also reduce the load coming toward Lake Accotink.
Thank you, Charles. From Brian Campbell, natural resources will be impacted as a result of the project. There's been an argument made tonight supporting that the temporary impact will yield a greater long-term gain for the lake and community as a whole. However, it's very common that these projects are planned and permitted with the minimum mitigation required for the impact of regulated resources to those resources. Can the project consider, or is the project considering mitigation of unregulated resources, such as loss of trees and disturbance to naturalized areas as part of the project scope where practical? Examples would be use of native seed mix for stabilization of disturbed areas, reforestation, invasive plant species removal, stormwater facility retrofits. I think this question would be answered either by Charles or Frank.
I'll take this one. So all of our projects incorporate a restoration plan. I think the biggest issue is that we won't know until we select alternatives what the impacts will be. Once we select those alternatives, we understand the impacts, then we'll work on a restoration. The rule is always avoid, minimize, mitigate. So we will work to avoid resources wherever we can, minimize the impacts when we have impacts, and then we'll mitigate wherever we can. We always use native plants in our restoration planting. The only time we don't use native plants, well, actually there aren't currently any projects that we're not using natives, except I will say if there's a requirement for a turf on a dam face, and those are actually, we're modifying those even to become more native in their total content. So yes, we'll work on restoration planting, invasive plant control on the areas where we are restoring, and we'll definitely work to minimize. So that's a question we'll address, I think, when we get to the alternatives analysis discussion. We better understand what potential impacts there might be.
Great, thank you, Charles. That looks like, we just got another question that came in. Thank you for this informative presentation. Huge accolades to the board and Fairfax County Park Authority on approving this project. Much needed and essential to our communities and the state. Noted. And unless anybody else has any further comments, here we have one from Kevin. What's the depth contemplated by the Marina? I'm guessing that is, how much are we planning on, how deep do we plan on dredging the depth near the Marina? Somebody from Arcadis want to answer that? The new depth?
Yeah, well, I guess, Adam, honestly, I don't know that we'd be in a position to provide any specific answers today. As I said earlier, we need to look at meeting the overall project goal for volume restoration of that lake. Certainly functionality of different areas of the lake are going to be taken into consideration. And I think that's something that we would work with Charles and the team to identify what is the right target depth for that in all areas of the lake, quite frankly. So
I'll just add one more note that we would also work with the Park Authority to determine if there's dredging around the marina, what are the most suitable depths to support the types of activities that you want to conduct around the marina. So that would be certainly a part of the discussion.
And definitely would, everybody would work together to ensure that the, stuff like the boating regattas and all the boats that go out of the marina, that it's an adequate depth for all those types of recreation. So unless anybody has any further questions, we've reached the end of questions that have been coming up in the chat. And just as a reminder, again, if you have any questions that you thought about after this meeting is over or at any time during this project, please visit the project website. It's on the screen, and you can log in your comments on that website at any time. And again, thank you, everybody. And Charles, do you want to give any concluding remarks?
I just want to thank everybody for coming this evening. We understand how important this project is, and the project team is very committed to making sure that we come back to you all with the clearest information we can in as timely a manner as possible. And we really appreciate your input. And then we will also, of course, as I said, be reaching out to a lot of the critical stakeholders to get feedback from them periodically, and working closely with Supervisor Walkinshaw and his staff to also help communicate and make sure we're taking all the right steps. So we look forward to, I've actually, just to let you know, we've offered to some of the folks, including the Friends of Lake Accotink Park, I think some of our staff will be coming out and talking at one of their meetings after the new year. So this won't be the only public outreach effort between now and the alternatives analysis. We'll be working with some of the stakeholder groups to do outreach through their venue. We'll also post information on the project webpage as it becomes available. So please check back with that webpage. In addition to the comments, you have the ability to sign up for email updates at the same place where the comments are. Just look for that. There's a button there that allows you to move on and put your contact information in. So that's the last piece I have. As a reminder, this presentation will be posted there along with the answers to the questions that we received this evening and those that were received through the comments through the webpage. Thank you all very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Charles, can you hear me?
Yes.
I stopped recording. It's still flashing. Does it take? Is this the part that takes quite a while that you have to keep the meeting open, or?
Yeah, I think what will happen is you'll see that when you move toward when the meeting closes out, your computer is still going to be saying it'll be capturing the information and converting it, I think is the term that it uses.
All right, well done, sir.
That was a good group of folks.
Questions?
Yeah.
There's actually folks still trying to get into the meeting.
So, but how many people were in attendance at its height?
Height, we had 94.
Sounds about right.
I got the peak I saw was 96, but what I did notice, it seemed like, Justin, you were letting a lot of people in and people were dropping out.